Hey everyone, Alex here. Before I play this episode, I'd like to apologize for the egregious delay between episode 1 and 2. Life got in the way, and I got distracted. I'm in college, which can take up a lot of my time, and recently I've started to get into Civil War reenacting, which I may do videos on in the future. In the meantime, I am back to video making as usual, and I will do my best to be more active from here on out. Anyway, without further ado, here is episode 2. Hello everyone, this is Alex. Welcome back to another episode of Placeholder History. This is the second episode in our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we started with the European discovery of the Americas and talked about some of the first expeditions and colonies. We left off in the year 1700. Britain had finally gotten into the colonization game, the 13 colonies were starting to take the form that we all know today, and France had colonized most of Canada and even started to go down the Mississippi River towards Spanish territory in the south. 3 great European powers, all vying to control the North American continent. But what happens when 2 of those superpowers end up in a fight over one little river valley? Well, that's what we'll be talking about today on Placeholder History. France and Britain were never really the best of friends during this period. In fact, the two nations had an extremely long history of war and tension between them, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, so it's no surprise that they'd be in fierce competition in the colonies. This competition, in turn, led to more tension, now between the French and British colonies. Following the War of Austrian Succession, which would end in 1748, both Britain and France claimed various territories in the Americas. One of the territories that both empires would claim to control was the Ohio River Valley, which was this general area. Both sides had fought over the territory during the War of Austrian Succession, with the French attempting to defend their trade and influence with native tribes against the British. This would prove unsuccessful, and the British were winning so badly that the Virginia colony even established the Ohio Land Company to acquire the territory of Ohio County. The British argued that this land was part of the Virginia colony, and the French claimed it as part of New France. Both nations had made significant economic investments in the area, and neither of them wanted to give it up. And so France decided to send Pierre-Joseph Céloron de Blainville on an expedition to ensure French control over the territory in 1749. Céloron would bury lead plates in the county around rivers and tributaries. These plates were laid with little ceremonies, with singing and bands and little musket salutes. They were a medieval way of claiming land, and one that didn't hold much authority. He also attempted to stop British traders from talking with the natives and sway the natives back to working with the French. He failed in just about every respect, and was for the most part ignored by both the British traders and the Native Americans, who had no interest in listening to him. Not wanting to lose valuable territory to the British, the French would send out another expedition, led by Paul Marin de la Malgue in 1753, to further secure French control of the territory. Marin decided to be more straightforward than his predecessor, Céloron, so he started to build forts in the area, physically blocking British colonists from entering the Ohio territory. This worried the governor of Virginia, who just so happened to be a major stockholder in the Ohio Land Company. So he sent a small company of men to tell the French to vacate Virginia's territory. And who might the commander of this small company of men be? Well, believe it or not, it's none other than George Washington. He was a 21-year-old major in the colonial militia, and he would take a very small party of troops with him to complete his task. They'd travel into the Ohio territory and arrive at a French fort named Fort Le Boeuf on December 12th of 1753. By now, Paul Marin had passed away, and the new commander of French forces in the region was Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, who invited Washington in for dinner. It was at this dinner that Washington gave him the Virginian governor's letter ordering all French forces to retreat. Legardeur, to paraphrase, basically said, "Hey, you can't tell me what to do. You're not the boss of me, and you're not French." So Washington left and returned to Virginia. By the time he was sent out again in early 1754, New France and the Virginia colony were in an unofficial state of war. He was dispatched to take another company of men to assist a man named William Trent in building British forts with which to fight the French. But he would come to find out while on his way that Trent had already surrendered to French forces. However, a Native American by the name of Tanagrason of the Mingo tribe had promised his support to the British, so Washington decided to continue on into French territory without William Trent. He would meet Tanagrason at Fort Duquesne, another French fort in the area. They'd join their two war parties there, making a combined force of 52 Virginian and Mingo soldiers. On the morning of May 29th, Washington's force would find and ambush a company of 40 Canadian French troops in what would be the first battle of the French and Indian War, the Battle of Jumonville Glen. It was notably short, with just 15 minutes of fighting before the French surrendered. After the battle, Washington pulled his forces back and constructed a fort, which he would call Fort Necessity. He would then shortly have to surrender this fort to the French after the Battle of Fort Necessity on July 3rd. Following these brief scuffles between Virginian and Canadian forces, both the British and the French would send military expeditions to the Americas to help their colonies fight the conflict. The British expedition, which is the one that we'll be focusing on for the most part, was led by a man named Major General Edward Braddock. His goal was to remove the French from the Ohio Territory and push them back into modern-day Canada. This would be easier said than done, however, as the French were very well dug in with their forts, and most native tribes were more willing to work with the French forces than a redcoat. So Braddock devised a very aggressive plan for the year of 1755, gathering 4 armies and placing them under the command of himself and 3 other officers: William Shirley, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time, Sir William Johnson, and a man named Colonel Robert Monckton. These 4 armies would be set out to capture forts in French territory. Major General Braddock would capture Fort Duquesne, Shirley would capture Fort Niagara, Sir Johnson would capture Fort St. Frederick, and Colonel Monckton would capture Fort Beauséjour. And so, as 1755 began, the armies would start to put their plan into action. Unfortunately, this campaign was a failure almost from the start. Major General Braddock set out for Fort Duquesne with 1,500 British and Virginian soldiers, including George Washington. They were ambushed on the way there by French, Canadian, and Native American forces. Most of the army was killed or captured, with only 500 troops making it back to British territory under George Washington's command. Braddock was killed during the ambush. Shirley's army never even left home, staying back to set up defenses after it turned out the French knew he was coming. Sir William Johnson was beaten back and unable to reach Fort St. Frederick. In fact, the only army to complete their goal was that of Colonel Monckton, who successfully captured Fort Beauséjour in June of 1755. In 1756, a new commander took over the British forces, a man by the name of General John Kemble, the 4th Earl of Loudoun. The French would be the ones in the offensive this time, however. In March, they destroyed Fort Bull, and they'd encouraged the Native Americans to raid frontier settlements throughout the year, causing widespread chaos. In August, they captured Fort Oswego. The French would continue to pressure the British throughout 1756 and 1757. Campbell attempted to invade Quebec, but he would be cut off by a French fleet waiting for him. Then Fort William Henry would be captured in August. The British were completely on the back foot now, having lost a large amount of forts to the French. British settlers were fleeing from their homes, heading east to the coast in an attempt to escape the fighting, but the British had a stroke of luck in 1758. They'd been blockading France, which cut off most of the French navy from resupplying their armies in the colonies. This, along with a very poor harvest in Canada and an epidemic of disease among the Native Americans, meant that French forces were completely crippled that year. General James Campbell would be replaced for 1758, following the defeats of the previous 2 years. The British forces would now be led by Major General James Abercrombie, who began to take advantage of his weakened enemy. He launched a 3-part offensive aimed to strike right at the heart of the French colonies. This offensive was a success. 2 out of the 3 attacks succeeded, with the British capturing Fort Duquesne and Fort Louisbourg. They were defeated at the Battle of Carillon, but still managed to end the year by destroying Fort Frontenac. After 1758, the British would replace their commander again, with Field Marshal Geoffrey Amherst taking over Abercrombie's job. After this point, the war becomes extremely one-sided. French forces were vastly outnumbered, and with what left of their momentum burnt out, there wasn't much they could do to stop the British forces who were marching through Canada. 1759 and 1760 saw the last 2 years of fighting in the colonies, as British and colonial forces finished conquering French Canada. The French would surrender Canada in 1760, following the Siege of Montreal, ending hostilities in the Americas. Fighting in Europe would continue for another 3 years before a peace treaty was signed that ended the war officially. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763. France had lost the war. They would go on to surrender all of their holdings on mainland America, with Canada and the Ohio River Valley becoming British territories. And that just about wraps up the French and Indian War, which is yet another very important piece of context for the American Revolution as a whole. Next time, we'll be talking about the aftermath of the war and the consequences that would result in the 13 colonies revolting against the crown. I'd talk about them here, but I think this video is already long enough. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video, though. It did take a lot longer than I'd planned, I'll be the first to admit. Same as last time, feel free to leave a comment, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will catch you all next time on Placeholder History.